Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Leo. Thank you to the LJS for hosting us and enabling us to have some space to have this conversation, both in person here at the LJS and on Zoom. But the biggest thank you goes to Daniel Taub, who's joined us this evening. I have to say this is the second time that we've been in conversation. We're going to go on the road. We've done Finchley last time, and you enjoyed it so much you've come back a second time to join us at the LJS. I'm sure that for most of you, Daniel doesn't need any introduction. In fact, Leslie was reminding us that you were with us for a patrons dinner at the House of Lords a number of years ago, and he's a diplomat, Israeli diplomat and international lawyer, served as the Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom during 2011 to 2015, and as director of strategy and planning of the Yad Hanadiv. Done a funny autocorrect on my organisation, held a whole range of legal and diplomatic posts. Extensively involved in the Israeli and Palestinian peace process, and led the Israeli side of the culture of peace track of negotiations. Educated here in the UK at University College Oxford and University College London, as well as at Harvard. We're really delighted you're with us, and it could not be, I mean, it was an interesting time when you came and saw us in Finchley at FPS, but I think it's an even more, I mean, interesting is somewhat under exaggeration for the moment that we find ourselves in, and we are really, I think, keen to hear from you about what you're thinking, what the experience is of being, I think, also here visiting at this moment with your play. Maybe you'll tell us about that at some point today, but particularly in Israel, in your position with your own experience, and we will take questions, but it would be good to hear from you in your own words what the last really few months have been like, and perhaps your thinking on where we are at the moment.
So first of all, it's lovely to be with you. Thank you so much. You know, I'm looking forward to our roadshow. I don't know where the next stop is. And I'm not sure. Well, first I should say I've just come from the rehearsal room for this play, and it's a real effort of the imagination to move yourself back into the Middle East. Working on a play is really, and at one stage I worked in television a little bit. It's almost like an antidote to working in government, because there you feel like you can't change anything. And here, with just a couple of lines, you change everything. Night becomes day, the good character becomes a bad character, or whatever, and so on. It's just like there's so much possibility. Sadly, though, it's not the reality. It's just fiction, but it does give you a sense of possibility, and that's not what you always get from living in the Middle East. I would say I've had a lot of conversations here, you know, since I've come, from a lot of people who care deeply about Israel. And one of the things that strikes me, one of the things that's strange about being an ambassador representing Israel, maybe even a little bit unique, is that if you're representing Israel, you're not representing one country, you're representing two countries. You're representing a sort of geopolitical entity, a state like any other state. But also for a lot of people around the world, particularly Jewish people, there's a sort of Israel within that you're a representative of. And it's something that's very close to their heart. And sometimes it's even a little bit strange. You're an ambassador and somebody will sit down, it could be a hardened businessman, and he'll start opening up to you like you're the Western Wall. And he does that because you are a representative of this very, very cherished space. And I think when those two Israels align, it's a very, very powerful, positive experience for people. If you ask me why it is that trips like Birthright have such a powerful impact on young people, it's precisely because what people hope for within and this physical place that they go to, there's a resonance between them and people get very excited. And yet, when there's a non-alignment, when there's a dissonance between that Israel within and that Israel without, that's a very painful experience. And I think for a lot of people, that's part of what is being felt at the moment. How does the Israel without, the Israel in the news, match up with the Israel that I cherish within? And the first thing that I want to say is I think that pain is important. And I think we will be in a bad situation if people stop feeling it, because it's a pain that comes out of caring. And, you know, better to have difficult conversations than to have no conversations at all. And I think that's something that we can all share. And the other thing, we can get into the politics, but one of the things that I would say is, I do deeply feel that that Israel within is still there, but you need to look a little bit harder to find it. And, you know, I spent, as you said, I spent the last 5 years working for Yad HaNadiv, is the Rothschild Foundation in Israel. And that is a very serious philanthropic foundation that tries to address the most long-term systemic challenges in Israeli society, whether it's in education, whether it's in the Arab community, whether it's in the environment, and so on. And in a way, it exposed me to the underbelly of Israeli society, and I sometimes joke I did things in the right order. It's much better to be a representative of your country before you really know your country and you discover all of those, you know. But it also exposed me to absolutely extraordinary sector of Israeli society, the third sector, which is full of these incredibly idealistic, passionate people who are spending their lives to make the country better. And I think it's a shame that for so many people the primary prism through which they connect with Israel is the things that hit the headlines, which is, you know, and I don't want to diminish, because the politics is important and legislation is important, and I'll be happy to talk about that. But that is not the bulk of the day-to-day life in Israel.
Sure, but one of the things we're hearing at the moment is the impact that the potential change of funding might have on some of those third sector, particularly those that are coming out of the progressive world. So even that lens for us at the moment is being distinctly clouded.
So I'll say a word. You know, I'm sure we'll have questions, and I really want to hear about the things that are of greatest concern, or the things that, or the hopes that you have, and so on. So I do think that at the level of the Israeli public, the Israeli population, there has not been a dramatic change in recent years. I think we are talking about a political change, but I think it's wrong to interpret that as a dramatic change in the Israeli public. The election results were very different partly because the center and the left were out-manipulated and handled the elections very poorly and ended up throwing a lot of votes away in a way that the right didn't. And even on the right, it turned out that people were voting for parties that tended to be further right than is their thinking, partly because the centre-right parties weren't running. Naftali Bennett closed down his party and so on and so forth. And partly because it's true that over the last year, there were some traumatic experiences for Israelis. You know, on the one hand, there were very positive signs to have a coalition in which you had Arabs sitting for the first time. On the other hand, people looked at mixed cities in Israel, and really close to home, they saw terrible violence. They were just in the week before the election. And so you had lots of people voting, but I don't think in terms of the Israeli public, we are talking about a dramatic change. I think we are talking about a coalition that is significantly different from the ones that we've seen, and we've had, you know, 4, 5 elections in 3 years and so on. And there's one other point that I want to make that I think is important. You know, I find a lot of people here are nostalgic for an Israel of the, I don't know, 1970s, 1980s, of, let's call it the Israel of Yitzhak Rabin or whatever. And I will say, I know this is not off the record, but I don't want it to be a headline, but I would say that that Israel was a wonderful Israel to live in if you were white and a man and Ashkenazi and secular. But if you were a member of any one of the other groups in Israeli society, you didn't really have a voice. If you were Mizrahi, or if you were Arab, or if you were Haredi, or even if you were national religious, you were generally disenfranchised in all sorts of ways. And we are living through a really important period in Israel's history where those disenfranchised groups are coming out of the corners and are saying we also need to have a voice and we need to have a say in how and what our shared space looks like. And that's a challenge for liberals small L. Because does liberal mean holding fast to our liberal values no matter what and insisting them? Or does liberal mean we believe in a liberal process of listening to everybody and allowing them to renegotiate this common space? And we are at that moment, and alongside all of the concerns, I think we need to recognize that a part of that is an expression of a feeling of disenfranchisement, of not having had a voice. And I think one of the things that we have to do, along with everything else, is make sure that we are listening to all of those voices.
So we'll come on, I think, to the impact on diaspora and for us as also as progressive Jews with a capital P. But before we get there, maybe it would be really helpful to summarise a little bit what you think might be some of the impacts of the current government, whether you think already you're seeing change internally, whether, I mean, who can answer, but is it going to be as bad as we expect? Is that already started? Where you see it currently?
So, I don't think anybody knows just yet. I don't think we know for all sorts of reasons. The coalition is finding its feet. It hasn't clearly made its priorities. The Prime Minister says he is going to be the one that's in the driving seat. It's not absolutely clear to what extent people are going to have leverage over him. I think one of the things that has people slightly concerned is that in previous coalitions there have been parties to the left of the Prime Minister, so that he was able to act as a moderating influence or say, you know, I would normally do this, but they're holding my hands and so on, and it's not entirely clear. There is a whole host of legislative initiatives that are on the table. It's hard to have an intelligent discussion about them because some of them are reasonable subjects for discussion. You know, there are a number of aspects of the Israeli legal establishment that really do deserve to be discussed. And it could be, and a fair number of people are arguing that although it was admirable, the Supreme Court in its previous incarnation has maybe gone a little bit too far. It's more than in most countries, you know, to allow a group of judges who are not elected to decide for themselves what is reasonable, which is one of the grounds for judicial review. It's a very, very broad reading of judicial review. You know, is it absolutely clear that legal advisors in government ministries shouldn't be appointed by their ministers? I think in the UK there are. I mean, if you take it step by step, you know, a lot of these things are worthy of discussion. One of the things that's very hard at the moment is we're not in the environment where we can have that thoughtful discussion. And the honest truth is, you know, Israel has, I'll say a word about Israeli democracy. On the one hand, Israeli democracy is truly a miracle. And the reason I say that is not just because we have had, even this government, whether you like it or not, is the result of a genuinely democratic election, and we have had, in very fractious times, 5 of these elections and so on. But first of all, you have to remember, Israel was established by a group of people, hardly any of whom came from countries where there was an actual functioning democracy at the time. It was not like the continuation of hundreds of years of the mother of all parliaments or whatever. It was people who were trying to make it up as they were going along. And secondly, they were trying to do this in a region where there was no democracy osmosing over the borders from your neighbouring countries. And on top of that, it was doing it in a time of genuine conflict. Now, I mean, this will date me, but I remember the Falklands War here in the United Kingdom. And I have to say, even during the Falklands War, which nobody could say was an existential threat to the people of, of Britain, it was primarily a threat to sheep, and it was a threat to a very small number of people in the Falkland Islands. But there were already people clamping down on the freedom of the press and all sorts of other things, and there was a sort of jingoism that struck in and so on. And that was, and then you start thinking about armed conflicts that reach to the heart of your cities, where everybody is sending their kids to be their front line. And in this environment, to maintain the degree of open self-criticism and so on, I think. And so I think for all of those reasons, sort of the democracy of Israel is, I don't think Israel is, in the front line of the models of democracy in the world, but it may well be in the front line of countries that are striving to be democratic in extraordinarily difficult environments. And I think we have to recognize that Israeli democracy, as vibrant as it is, as open as it is also a little bit wonky, like most democracies are. So, for example, we don't have a constitution, like Britain doesn't have a constitution. We don't have a second house. We don't have a House of Lords or a Senate or whatever. And that means that over the years it's sort of fallen to the Supreme Court to play a role that is not entirely natural for a Supreme Court. We're a little bit of a constitution, we're a little bit of a second house and so on. And that's a constant process of negotiation. And it's not exactly clear, how we are going to renegotiate that.
And so the implication of what you're saying is that we wait and see, or is the fear real?
So I think every time you play with the structures of democracy, you're right to be concerned. These are very, very serious things. But there is something that I would point out, which is sort of striking to me about the proposals that are on the table at the moment. And the proposals on the table at the moment, as I understand them, they don't move Israel to the right as much as they empower whichever government is in power at the moment. And so what that says to me is, okay, we are now going to have a right of centre government that is going to have its say, possibly on the composition of the court more than it has in the past and so on. But when a left of centre government comes along, it will enjoy all of the additional leverage that this right of, so it's, what it strikes me is we're moving, unless this is, I'll say a word about whether it will actually happen, but if it does happen, it's not necessarily that we're moving crazily to the right, we're moving to an environment where the swing of the pendulum is going to be further in each direction, rather than some sort of, we're not rewriting the Declaration of Independence and so on. The other thing I would say is, I have been trying to think about this in the slightly longer term, and there's a medium longer term and a longer term. So the medium longer term, if you look back over the last 5 years, you can point to a large number of very troubling bills that have been put forward the Knesset, and the vast majority of them have been stopped before the brink. And we can argue the current situation is different, but I think there is a legitimacy in saying we have seen scary white papers before, let's see actually what happens with it. And the second thing I would say, and again it will date me, but thinking about people who are deeply, deeply troubled about the state of Israel democracy, when I was an undergraduate, those same voices were being heard because it was the time of the Begin-Sharon government and the invasion of Lebanon. And that, in a way, was a far more shocking situation than the situation that we were at the moment. Lying to the security cabinet, genuine large numbers of casualties and so on and so forth. And as troubling as that period was, if you look at it in the longer perspective, it was a significant diversion from the trajectory of Israel, more than it was the story of where Israel is going to be. So again, I draw some out of that.
Before we take questions, and I promise we'll come back to those of you at home and those of you with us, when you were here with us last time, one of the topics that we spent quite a long time talking about was our young people. And one of the things I can say as somebody who is seeing both our young people who are Bogrim, our graduates, as well as those who are coming up, who are at the edge of 16, who would usually be on Israel tour this summer, and we have in the UK vast swathes of our young people going to Israel, is that we're seeing real questions about whether now is the time to say enough, that it's been difficult enough to have an engagement, to encourage our young people to stay in the picture, and there are all sorts of reasons for that, including some we explored last time, which are just the financial situation, that now that people have to pay for university and the current living cost of living, that a year in Israel is not necessarily a viable financial ability, down to now an added disenchantment with Israel, and actually that it's the more that disengagement continues, the less chance that we have to bring it back. So yes, there's precedent in the past for difficult moments in that relationship, but I think many of our fear, or for some people even agreement with, is that relationship between diaspora and the UK, beginning with our young people, but following through from parents and from many members of our community, is something is being permanently severed. And I think for many of us that believe that we shouldn't be severing that feels like a real fear.
So I hear that. I would suggest, and I know it's not a solution, but it's, I think, a direction, trying to speak to your younger generation in a slightly different way about Israel. I don't think Israel is this heirloom, this embarrassing painting that you were given by your grandparents, and if you don't hang it on the wall of your living room when they come to visit, it's going to be a family broigus or something. Israel is far more a blank canvas, and it's a canvas that we paint together. And I think the question that people need to ask is, we have this incredible opportunity. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the philosopher, once said something really extraordinary, and this is obviously 100 years before, the Zionist movement and so on. He said, we will never know what the Jews have to say until they have a country of their own. And that doesn't mean that Jews don't have something to say. Jews always have something to say. But it does mean that when you ask yourself, well, what is a Jewish policy in relation to climate change? What is a Jewish social policy? What is a Jewish this? Here we have a canvas in which we can explore all sorts of things that we haven't really been able to develop fully in this period of time that we've been in the diaspora, or continuing to be in the diaspora, and so on. And if you think of Israel only as a country that has to prove its credentials in order to deserve my attention, I think you're missing something. It is the largest Jewish community in the world, and these are your family. And if you
I think the difficulty, though, Daniel, is that I think that what feels like is happening at the moment is that family is saying, actually, we don't want to be in a relationship with you. And I think that's the difference from when you were here last time to now. I think that I've seen a dramatic, noticeable, tangible difference in that sentiment.
So I hear that, and it's important for me to hear that. But I do think it is giving undeserved attention to a relatively small sector and loud sector of Israeli society. I think the vast, for people in the progressive movements who feel that the current leadership in Israel is disenfranchising them, I think it has to be absolutely clear that the vast, vast majority of Israelis embrace have no qualms whatsoever. We're talking about, you know, small groups that were always there and today unfortunately have more of an authoritative voice. But when Jews anywhere are in trouble in any way, Israelis will be reaching out to them, and they will not be asking somebody to come up with their parents' marriage certificates before they send Israel to go and protect them, or before the Israeli security services work with CST in order to make sure all of those synagogues are protected and so on. And so that's not to say it's not an issue, but I think we do need to keep hold of that larger picture. You know, and I think the point of family is not that everybody in the family is always going to see you on the best table at the Simplers and everything's going to be lovey-dovey. But I think is that when something goes awry, your first instinct is, what role can I do in repairing this relationship? Rather than saying, no, you didn't deliver, I'm going to close off and, you know.
So I think following on from that, we have a question from Karen. Karen Newman, member of the LJS and also the Deputy Chair of Liberal Judaism.
Yeah, I suppose following on from what Charley's just said, I suppose one of the things that interests me is, what does supportive behaviour look like in an environment where progressive Jews might just not count as being Jewish anymore? What does supportive behaviour look like if you actually care about LGBT rights? How do we as progressives support the voices in Israel which maybe are not aligned, which you say are the majority, but they're not manifesting themselves in government at the present time? So what does supportive behaviour look like?
So first of all, I think it is a point I made in our last discussion. I think there is an enormous amount to be done at the level of people to people that cannot be done necessarily at the level of the official leadership. You know, first of all, in terms of progressive movements, you know, people focus on the noises that are coming out of parts of the government at the moment, but actually the last 3 decades has been an extraordinary success story for non-Orthodox Judaism in Israel. Where I live in Jerusalem, I don't know if it's that typical, but where I live in Jerusalem, within 10 minutes walk of my house on a Shabbat morning, is every conceivable spectrum of synagogue, from egalitarian this to humanistic that to goodness knows what, to Haredi to whatever and so on. The spate, the expansion of non-Orthodox learning opportunities in Israel. I've become a little bit friendly with Ruth Calderon, who's an extraordinary woman in Israel. She was a member of Knesset. She has started sort of a chain of secular yeshivot, I suppose you would call them. And I went there because she has a bet midrash for actors and directors and so on and so forth. And there's just a... So first of all, I think plugging in to these worlds is very important. The second thing, by the way, and here's the point I would make about kids, I would say you know, one of the reasons that not just Israel, but almost anything has become more complicated over the last couple of decades is that the world has moved from an era of broadcasting to an era of narrowcasting. There is no longer a one-size-fits-all, whether it's newspapers, whether it's radio programs, whether it's whatever. Somebody made the point about Israel, and I thought it was interesting. Said, if you ask somebody to try and imagine a picture of Israel in 1948, most people can conjure up an image. It's, you know, it may well be a group of people dancing the horror around a radio in the streets or whatever. Ask them to paint a picture of Israel in 1967, and again, 3 paratroopers looking up at the Kotel or whatever it is, but something that captures the era. Ask somebody now, and there isn't a single picture. There simply, I mean, as ambassador, I had some very bizarre evenings where I would have to go to a couple of events, and at the first event, I was talking to funders, talking about how hard up Israel was, how they needed to support the weaker populations. And then I'd be going off to some business event where I'm saying this is this startup nation that you can rely on and you should be investing in, and I've got these 2 dramatically different Israels, and which is the one that I'm supposed to do? And that means there isn't a silver bullet here. But what it does mean, I think, is to start your relationship with Israel, in a sense, by looking inwards. What are your core values? What are the things that you cherish? What are the things that you admire? What are the things that you hope for? And then identifying those within Israel. And that could be in the non-profit sector, it could be in the political sector, whatever. And supporting your values where you see them being lived. And I think that is the most resilient relationship. And I would not, I don't think it's sustainable to ask somebody to support Israel when there isn't a consonance between what they're supporting and what they truly feel. But the Israel that you hope for is there somewhere. And I would encourage you to reach out. And often these individuals or these groups or these organizations or these communities are really in need of support and nurturing and connection abroad. So that's the direction I would suggest to think about.
We have a question from online, and then we'll come back into the...
Sure.
Tom.
Right, I'm going to bring myself on. Yeah, I'm very used to bringing other people on, not me. That's so we got a question from the chat. Can or will the Palestinians ever have a sovereign state of their own? If yes, when and on which land? And I ask this because we need peace there and stopping the loss of life on both sides.
So would you like the date and the exact area? I just want to clarify exactly what it is. No, I'm not being serious. So I have spent a fair amount of time in the negotiating room with the Palestinians, and actually not all of the time that I spent in the negotiating room was real negotiations, because you have quite a lot of period of time where you're in the room, and I think it's hard to call it real negotiations. I'll tell you what was one of the most inspiring periods. I was, and Rabbi Charley mentioned it, I was the head of the Israeli side of a track of negotiations called the Culture of Peace negotiations. And my partner was a Palestinian academic called Sufyan Abu Zaida. And we didn't know what we should be doing in these negotiations. So I suggested to him that we should travel to Northern Ireland and see if we could learn something from their experience. So we wangled a trip, and it was, we learned a lot, but the most inspiring thing was to see how difficult it was, not just to reach agreement, but to keep that peace alive. Here, we were there probably 10, maybe 15 years after the Good Friday Agreement. Not a single one of those peace walls in Belfast had been taken down. And you had these incredibly talented people holding this thing together with sticky tape. And it was inspiring because all of a sudden peace seemed real to us in a way that it hadn't before. And one of the things that I realize is that, the international community comes to Israel and Palestinians, they say, bang your heads together, draw a line on a map and we'll have a signing ceremony in the Rose Garden on the White House lawn and so on. And it has no real resonance amongst the people of the region. When I was in the negotiations, I remember one time I was leaving the house early in the morning, and one of my younger kids saw me leaving with my suitcase. He said, Abba, where are you going? I said, I'm going to the negotiations. He said, what are you trying to achieve? I said, peace. He said, no, really. Like, he didn't believe it. So I think we need to be much more realistic. It is extremely complicated. Sometimes I'll be traveling, I lecture sometimes about conflict resolution. I'll be speaking in the States, and then the head of the conflict resolution faculty of this university will come up to me, and he'll take a document, he'll dump it on the table. He said, we had a seminar about your conflict last semester. There's the permanent status agreement, no copyright issues, feel free to use it. And so I'll say something like, oh, that's really interesting. Can you tell me how you dealt with the electromagnetic sphere? And their face suddenly drops. Because what do you mean? I said, well, we have an indivisible electromagnetic sphere. It has important commercial considerations, it has important security implications. How did you decide to deal with it? And the truth is he never thought about it at all. It just was, And so it really is complicated. The sad truth is, I think there are, I don't want to say nobody, but I think because of all sorts of reasons we can go into, there are very few people that think that there is a realistic prospect of a process that will achieve a final resolution of the conflict in the foreseeable future. Now, a lot of people come to Israel and they leave and they say, everybody's a pessimist. But I think they're asking the wrong question. Because I think if you ask most people that question, the answer will be, sadly, no. Experience of what happens when you withdraw from territory, what happened in Gaza, what happened in South Lebanon, what would be the implications of it, etc., etc., etc. But if you ask yourself a different question, which is, do we identify opportunities for improving the opportunities and the prosperity of Palestinians and the opportunities for cooperation between them, then I think there's a whole range of issues in which the answer is yes. And if the question is whether we can improve the situation, and I think there's still a lot of people that want to. And, it's interesting that, people say it's not on the radar of Israelis at the moment, but peace is, with the Palestinians, is not further from the Israeli imagination than peace with Egypt was before Israel reached peace with Egypt. Israel had just fought a very bloody war with Egypt, in which thousands of Israelis were killed, and the reports of Egyptian brutality and prisoners and so on and so forth. And all it took was Sadat coming to the Knesset in Jerusalem, and there was a very, very sudden change. And I don't think it's disappeared, but I do think it's something that is not on the top of the consciousness, partly because only so long can people continue with hopes and getting them dashed and so on. And that's not to say that there isn't equally deep frustrations and fears and concerns on the Palestinian side as well.
So we have a question, one more from online, and then please, if you indicate the room, I'll come to you, from Claire Jackson. Claire.
Hello, I'm not online. Anyway, I was interested when you were saying that in the time of Yitzhak Rabin, there wasn't so much representation for diverse communities. And I believe you were implying that now there is more. And could you tell me the groups which are now better represented, please?
Sure. So, no, the point I was making was that during that period, there was a very dominant, you might call it a hegemony, of the labor Zionist movement, which was basically the Ashkenazi secular elite that had been the primary founders of the state. I think what you are seeing today is a lot more public activity, outreach from smaller communities, other sectors, including the Arab sector, which just in the previous coalition had its first, coalition partner, party, from the Haredi sector, from the Mizrahi sector, from the religious sector. That's not to say that they were not representatives, but they are now, if you look at the complexion, they are fighting for their public space. And, in a sense, one way, certainly regarding the Jewish sectors of Israeli society, sometimes one of the ways that I think about it is, Israel arose after 2,000 years of exile, and all sorts of groups came together, and each of these groups had sort of learnt a different lesson during this period of exile. There were some who learned that the only way we can survive is by being tough, by being the Maccabees. There are some that learned that the only way that we can survive is by being intellectually elite and so on and so forth, and proving our way. There are some that said the only way we can survive is to preserve our culture by building the walls of the ghetto as high as possible. And now we have, within 4 cubits, within the space of Israel, all of these different defense mechanisms, if you like, trying to figure out together how they build a society. And it's an extraordinarily complicated enterprise. I think there are here and there small signs of hope. I don't want to overstate them, But I'll share with you a project that I was involved with, which for me was a very moving project. So while I was at the Rothschild Foundation, we developed a course, an online course about Israeli democracy that would be taught in universities and colleges in Israel. And we put together a steering committee of representatives of all parts of Israeli society, intellectuals, but from the left, from the right, from the Arab community, from the ultra-Orthodox community, and so on. And the challenge was, can we come up with a single course where each unit is agreed, that identifies the major challenges facing Israeli society and gives voice to all of the different positions on that issue. So one unit would be about Shabbat in the public space, another one would be about Arab land rights, and so on, very contentious issues. And as you can imagine, this is Israel, these were pretty high decibel discussions, but we came to agreement, and this course is now being taught in all Israeli universities and a large number of colleges in Israel. And not only that, the Ministry of Education has now commissioned that same team to produce a similar course like this for high schools, based on civics, and the notion that you can, it's very sad in Israel, there are almost 4 hermetic education systems. So somebody who's in the national religious stream will rarely meet somebody who is in the secular stream, who will hardly ever meet somebody who is in the Arab stream, and who will never meet anybody who is in the ultra-Orthodox. But all of those streams are being exposed to this same discussion, and that doesn't mean that we agree, but at least there is some kind of basis. And I found that, a small cause for hope.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and then Igor, and then we'll come. We've got Leslie, and we have 3 questions online, and we're going to get them all in the next 15 minutes. Jeffrey.
So, Ambassador, I'd like to. This comes from the fact that I used to get called on to press TV, and it was great fun. I enjoyed it. And I remember with one gentleman, I actually gave him a quote from the Quran, and he looked at me and he said, "I can answer anything you want on politics, but don't get me involved." I happen to feel that religion itself is probably a more interesting area in which to tackle the problem. And my question, what I say to our Muslim friends, and I'll be seeing them on Shabbat in fact, is that something, we both pray to the same God. We pray to Allah. I've checked it out with all the rabbis, liberal, Haredi, and all of them. We all agree we pray to Allah. And we put Allah in a very difficult position because he's answering prayers from you and he's answering prayers for us. And I'm not sure he knows what to do. But the question I want to ask you is on the Jewish side, as a Jew. And the question is very simple. Do you feel that the creation of Israel and its continued existence represents the bestowal from the Almighty, the God of the Torah, of miracles upon the land of Israel and upon the Jewish people who live in it? That's the question. But as a Dati, I'm interested in your answer.
So I have to say, I think religion, or being a person of faith, cuts many different ways when it comes into questions of peace. Not just peace, all sorts of other questions of policy and so on. Again, it's not for me to determine whether something's a miracle and something's not a miracle. I think if you look at the awesomeness of Jewish history, you do have to say that the return of a people to its land, the revival of a language, the bursting of culture and Jewish knowledge and so on, is an event unprecedented in 2,000 years, and you have to sort of take stock. But I'm very wary about turning that into a sort of policy formation. I'll give you a simple example. So one of the big policy debates in Israel recently revolved around Ukrainian refugees. Not Jewish, but suffering, should we be taking in? And it's not just Ukrainian, we have, if coming across Egypt and large numbers from Africa and so on, to what extent should Israel have open house for people coming, not Jewish, but coming from places of, etc. And then you ask yourself, well, what is the Jewish response to that question? And on the one hand, you would say, we are Jews, we know what it is to be stateless, we know what it is to be refugees around the world. That should encourage us to open. On the other hand, we're aware that with all the states in the world, there is only one that is actually dedicated to preserving the Jewish character and being a crucible of Jewish creativity and so on. And that suggests that there's an importance to keeping a sort of uniqueness and so on. So there you have the same Jewishness, but it's pulling you in two different directions. But I do want to say somewhere where I agree very deeply with you. I think for many, many years, the approach to the people who were leading the negotiations was that we need to keep people of faith outside the negotiating room. You know, even if we open the door to the right kind of people of faith, somehow or other the wrong ones are going to come in and it's going to make it impossible to resolve. And I think that's mistaken. I think it's mistaken firstly because they're already inside the room in one way or another. But also I think that within our repositories of faith are resources that are necessary in helping, not to mention the fact, I mean, one of the most moving things that I did was when I was in London, and I held off on doing it for a while because I thought, Israeli ambassador, it's sensitive, but I held an iftar, and it actually landed on a Jewish fast day, and we broke the fast together. The Jewish fast, actually the Jewish fast went out after Ramadan went out, so it's the only place I've ever been that other people were eating and Jews weren't eating. It's not the normal state of affairs, but there is something about the intimacy of those connections and sharing those points of contact. And I've been involved in a number of track 2 dialogues in which people of faith reach out to each other. And I think it's a mistake, and I think actually now there is more of a realization that yes, faith comes with a lot of challenges, and some people who are associated with faith can take you off in dangerous directions. But if you want to make peace, that's also a resource that you need to channel and bring into the room.
Thank you. So let's come to a question from online. I have Joe. Joe Goldblatt.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you, Ambassador Taub, for your inspiring and very interesting views. And thank you for your service to the people of Israel as our former ambassador and to worldwide Jewry. I'm in Edinburgh, Scotland, as you can probably tell by my thick Scottish accent. However, I am also a supporter of the state of Israel. And I know that every time there is an uprising or a political issue in Israel, there is a correlation with anti-Semitism rising throughout the world. As chairman of the Edinburgh Interfaith Association, I was wondering if you could tell me how we can encourage the Israeli government, third sector organizations to do a better job of promoting all the success stories of Israel throughout the world, to give us more positive, soft peace, politics, diplomacy opportunities. There's no country in the world except for Scotland that I know of that's given the world so much good in such a short period of time as Israel. So tell us how we can be a force for good to promote this worldwide.
First of all, thank you for the question, and thank you for everything that you are doing for Israel in Scotland. I don't think there is, as it won't surprise you, a silver bullet in relation to Israel's image around the world. I think usually, I'm not sure that touting Israel's technological prowess or even of its international aid, which is something to be proud of, is going to be a particularly effective strategy in trying to argue against people whose criticism against Israel comes from a different direction completely. I have to say, I think that the greatest asset that Israel has is the reality, is genuinely the reality. I know, I have brought many, many people to Israel, and I don't think I can think of anybody who was not familiar with Israel, who did not leave with a deeper and more sympathetic and empathetic understanding of Israel after meeting the people of Israel. And so I don't know how feasible it is, but my single suggestion, if I had to limit it to one, is to take the people that you care about and the people of influence and say, I want to share my Israel with you. I want you to meet everybody you want to, not on one side of the divide and everybody, but my feeling is that they will probably come back with better tools to understand what's going on, and when difficulties arise, probably be more sympathetic.
So we've had a kind of an additional question online, which I feel like I need to raise for the, which is from Johnny, who's asked about the Al Jazeera journalist who was killed, and said that the Israeli government refuses to bring the soldier to book. Incidents like this bring shame on the entire Jewish people. That's his question. Do you agree that actions like the IDF in this case endanger us in the diaspora and bring Judaism into disrepute and thereby feed anti-Semitism?
So I don't know. I was not in government at the time of this particular incident of the Al Jazeera.
And we're not expecting you to answer on behalf of the government. I think it's just important to say here that online there's...
No, first of all, it is important that I hear that. But I have been involved in other instances where there have been pretty tragic incidences, and I've seen the process that Israel goes through to investigate itself. And I have to say, I used to work part of my army service. Part of my army service, I was a combat medic, and part of it I was in the International Law Division. And I remember once my supervising officer wrote an article describing the lengths Israel goes to in order to avoid civilian casualties. And they circulated amongst the legal advisors of other militaries in the world, Canada, the United Kingdom, and so on. And the response that they got was, can you please make sure that you don't make it sound like all of these measures are mandated by international law, because we're not sure that we would necessarily behave the same way in those circumstances. That doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes. But the fact that somebody is killed tragically doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is culpable criminally. You're talking about, of necessity, our soldiers are young, are drawn from all walks of life and so on. And I certainly don't think that the country should, because of fears of the way this is going to be received abroad, put people on trial if they don't deserve to be put on trial. You know, the fact is you have to maintain faith in the system, and you just think what it would mean for Israel's security if a large number of people felt that Israel didn't have their back. On the other hand, I am very, very much in favor of maintaining scrupulous self-investigation, not just because we need it for ourselves, but actually because that is the strongest protection that Israel has against Israeli soldiers being arrested by international tribunals and put on trial. These tribunals tend to work on the principle of complementarity, which means that if they have been fully investigated, put on trial, punished or not punished by a functioning internal system, then they cannot be grasped by somebody else. So I think we have strong internal reasons and strong external reasons for maintaining those standards.
Harriet.
A few things. Thank you so much for what you've been offering. Before we rewind, you talked about Israeli democracy and the miracle of Israeli democracy. But the one thing that you didn't mention that does seem to be a major obstacle is Israel's version of proportional representation. It does seem to be the major problem, actually, of how we end up with these bizarre coalitions. I'm in favor of proportional representation, but not the degree that Israel has seems to be extremely problematic. And I wonder if there's any, you say there isn't a constitution, but that somehow needs to be grappled with in terms of the geopolitical, because it seems, we're fated to have these problems. But then you were talking about Israel, the geopolitical, and in our hearts. And of course, not in everybody's heart is the same Israel's.
Absolutely.
So that's one thing to flag up. But also, it's almost as if you're also saying, we can have relationships with Israel irrespective of the government. And in one sense, I totally understand that. I don't support this government, I haven't supported the British government for quite a long time, and I still live here, as we all do. But it's easier when you're living somewhere than when you have an international relationship, even if it's a very deep-rooted relationship. And in terms of diaspora, your relationship is much more usually either with your family there or at the bigger level. And particularly, you know, Karen and I are on the board of deputies. It's about who we invite. Oh, sorry, Danny too, sorry. And you know, it's about who we invite, who we don't invite at that level. And you know, there are big discussions about whether we would dream of inviting certain ministers, and the hope is that we wouldn't actually. And that's a very tragic place to be at. And when the fellow from Edinburgh was talking about the third sector, yeah, how do we strengthen our relationships with the Israel that you feel so grounded in, and that we might feel more comfortable with, and to be able to strengthen it, because that's what needs to happen.
So there was a lot in there. I'll just pick up on one or two points. I'll pick up on one. So first of all, I'm not a political scientist. I don't think that changing the Israeli electoral system is a solution. There may be tweaks that would be helpful. We have in the past played around with it. One of the times we played around with it, the results were so contrary to what anybody expected that we actually had to change it straight back. It was a disaster when we went to direct election of the Prime Minister, if you remember, in the 1990s. There are some proposals to have a sort of 50% constituency system. It's very different, though, to the UK situation, because you don't have particularly homogenic geographic sort of areas and so on. I do think we need to think about it, but I also think that any system that we have is going to be stretched to breaking point, because we're talking about a society that is so ethnically, ideologically varied and dealing with so many fundamental, even existential issues. You know, so I don't think we can say, oh, if only we would do this, that will respond to it. I'm not sure that I buy that world jury's primary relationship with Israel has to be through the government, I'll be honest. I think I, as a citizen, who have to pay my taxes and have to do all sorts of other things and have to do military service, I am much more embedded with the structures of Israeli society than somebody who lives outside and can choose which part of Israeli society they want to engage with and develop it. I mean, in the time that I was here in the UK, I met one guy who loves film, and he developed a film co-production agreement between Britain and Israel, and it's led to all sorts of things, and that's amazing. And I met a guy who was a heart surgeon. He's developed relationships between heart surgeons here and heart surgeons in Israel, and all sorts of other people. And particularly in a world of you know, social media and internet, I don't think that's so difficult. I mean, it's not. So that's not to say there are not. And particularly if you've chosen to be elected for the Board of Deputies, you've chosen to operate on a certain level where there are significant policy decisions, various other questions of engagement and so on, and I respect that. But if somebody, you know, I say to people who care about Israel, don't let your relationship with Israel be defined by your defense of Israel or your criticism of Israel. You should have those things, let them be there. But your relationship with Israel should be predicated on something and particularly if you want that relationship to pass to the next generation. They are not going to embrace a relationship that is a constant battle, but they will respect something that is nurturing and inspiring, and my belief is that there is a lot of potential for those relationships.
Thank you. I'm going to do two closing questions, if that's okay. I'm going to take one from online, which is from David Keyes from the Ark Synagogue, who says, things are sadly drifting towards a de facto one-state outcome. In your view, could that ultimately destroy the state of Israel? And Rabbi Igor, please, yes. Do you want to ask your question, and perhaps you can take both of them?
My question will sound a little bit, aggressive and provocative, but it is not. I'm genuinely interested in your answer. Why do I need relationship with Israel?
So if I were to ask you as a rabbi, why do I need to be Jewish? Have you got an answer to that question?
Yes.
And what's the answer?
Because it's about your identity and your feeling belonging somewhere.
And 50% of the people that you say you're belonging to happen to be living in this space together, struggling to find some kind of Jewish expression. And it's interesting, you tell me you have family in the Ukraine. Maybe you here in the UK don't need Israel, but just look at those Jewish communities in the Ukraine and in Russia. And who was it that looked out for them, went there, made sure that every one of them had travel documents that could get to a place of safety, and not do it just for the Jews there. Israel going an incredible way, representing the state of Israel with Israeli flags, helping refugees as they cross the border, and promising to be there not just for a few months but for 5 years, because that's the period of time that they think it's going to take, and so on. And nobody's going to force you, but if your Jewishness is important to you, out of a sense of family, out of a sense of belonging, out of a sense of potential, I would say it's something that you have to think about seriously. And I don't want to go into the politics of a one-state solution and so on. I spend a lot of time committing myself to trying to work towards negotiating a two-state solution. Maybe it's a cynical, maybe I'll finish with a sort of Dvar Torah, a word of Torah on this week's parasha that may be relevant. So this last week, we read the first commandment in the Torah. It came in the portion of Bo. It was actually to set up a calendar. That was as the children of Israel were leaving Egypt. But this is a strange thing, because we've read an entire book of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus, and now we come to the first commandment. And probably the most famous commentator in Jewish history is a commentator called Rashi. And Rashi asks the question, actually at the very beginning of the Torah, why do we need the whole of the book of Genesis? It's a law book. Why don't we start with the first commandment that we just read? And he comes up with a slightly strange answer. He says there will come a time when the nations of the world will come to you and they will say the land of Israel doesn't belong to you. It says actually that here Hebrew is listim atem, you're a bunch of thieves. And then when that happens, you can point to the book of Genesis and say God created the world and God gave it to us and this is our land. So if you think about it, it's quite remarkable that here is Rashi writing 1,000 years after the exile and 1,000 years before the establishment of the state of Israel, and here he was anticipating the debates in the United Nations that were going to happen and so on. But his response is a pretty nationalistic response. But this is the Jewish tradition, so Rashi is not the end of the story. And a generation later you have Ramban, Nachmanides, and he asks the same question, why do we need all of these stories of Genesis? And he says, well actually if you look at them, they have a common theme. And the common theme is that if you misbehave, you get thrown out of the land. Adam and Eve misbehave, they eat the apple and they get sent out of the Garden of Eden. Cain sins and spends his life wandering. The generation of Noah sin and get wiped off the face of the earth. The generation of the Tower of Babel sin and get scattered, and so on and so forth. And he says if you look at the stories of Genesis, they have a message, and that is our ownership of land is not absolute, it's contingent. It's contingent on our behavior. So if you think about that, you have a political debate between Rashi and Ramban 1,000 years ago, one of who says our hold on this land is absolute, and the other one who says no, our ownership of this land is dependent on the quality of the life we create, it's conditional. And first of all, I think that's fascinating, but one of the things, this particular debate echoed with me in the years that I was an ambassador for Israel. Because the conclusion I came to is that we really need to keep Rashi in one pocket and Ramban in the other pocket. And sometimes we will go abroad and we will go to, committees of the United Nations that have condemned Israel more times than all the other countries in the world combined. It's an outrage. And in those situations, we need to be able to respond with the forcefulness of Russia. We are not going to accept that we are more, less deserving of a country than anybody else. But then we turn around and then we come back home. I come back home to Jerusalem. And that has to be the time when you put Rashi back in your pocket and take Ramban out. And that's the time that you realize that ultimately our hold is conditional. And our right to live in this land really is dependent on the quality of the society that we build.
I mean, what a place to end, and in some ways to begin another conversation. And I want to add a kind of midrash to your commentary, which is I'm asked a lot why we stay in that relationship, and for me there is a sense in exactly what you say about the in one pocket and in the other, which is a very in of itself Jewish tradition, which is it's in that place of mutuality in this conversation, in us understanding both our importance, of Israel's importance to us, and I think personally we should be reclaiming the language of religious Zionism, that actually that doesn't belong to another group, but actually we should be talking about our relationship and the values that we give to that relationship. But that also Israel needs us in the diaspora in terms of bringing our voice to the table, and that if we leave the conversation, then, and I've heard so much in what you've said tonight about the importance of us connecting with those voices within Israel which need us to lift up their voices. And so thank you for reminding us of that, and for answering the questions that come from many different places. And I'm very sorry that we didn't get to all of yours. But, Daniel and I are going to be on the road, and so we're coming soon to a community near you where we will take your questions. Thank you all for being with us, both in person and in line, and really thank you very much. We really do appreciate you being with us.